The Reverdaughter was no simple hole in the ground, built high above the riverbank and stretching out from the dormitories. The structure featured long wooden benches with evenly spaced openings, some large enough for the more corpulent friars, others narrow for the novice boys. The waste fell freely down chutes carved into the masonry, emptying directly into the river. Aldrich was responsible not only for keeping the benches scrubbed and the wood free of rot, but also for timing river tides. If the waters were low, the stench lingered and drew flies, his ancient enemy. No one praised Aldrich for his vigilance, but no one could bear his absence either. He walked with a crooked staff and knew the weight of every sigh that escaped the Reverdaughter door, but monasteries were the exception, not the rule. For the common folk, sanitation was improvised, raw, and often unbearable. Outside the village of Dunwald, little more than a cluster of thatch-roofed huts hugged the edge of the forest like frightened sheep. Families lived tightly packed, 10, sometimes 12, to a single-room home where smoke curled through holes in the ceiling, and chamber pots served as nighttime necessities. These were no elegant pots with ceramic glazing or ivory trim. Most were clay, cracked from years of use, and rarely emptied more than once a day. Children were often the ones tasked with carrying these pots, slopping with urine and human waste outside to the dung heap or the roadside gutter. That gutter was simply a ditch that curved past the baker's door and pooled beneath the tanning shed, where flies already held dominion. Rain, though a relief to crops, became a nightmare for hygiene. The ditches overflowed, human waste swirling through muddy streets, soaking hems of dresses and the bare feet of boys running errands. Magda, the midwife, understood the danger more than most, having watched mothers lose children to fevers brought on by unseen miasmas. She began spreading a peculiar practice in the village. She burned dried rosemary near privy holes. She urged families to dig deeper pits farther from the home. And perhaps most scandalous of all, she suggested men relieve themselves not by the hearth, as tradition held, but in the fields. The older men scoffed. They had no interest in changing rituals older than their grandfathers. But as another round of summer sickness killed off 5 children in 1 week, Magda's whispers became gospel. Hygiene, though no one used. That word was slowly becoming spiritual. Meanwhile, in the heart of the local manor, the Lord's garderobe was as much a show of power as it was a toilet. Sir Reginald de Gaunt, broad-shouldered and red-faced from Daily Mead, took pride in his tower chamber with its stone seat. A chute dropped waste into a moat below, which the servants stirred with long poles to keep it moving. His garderobe was perfumed with crushed herbs pressed into the stones, and beneath the seat lay dried moss and lichen for wiping. Paper was too dear. Cloth was reusable, but moss was free and absorbent. Lady Aveline, however, abhorred the smell. No amount of lavender in her chamber could mask the scent drifting up from the shaft. She commissioned the carpenter to build a second seat, one that could be covered with a thick wooden lid, and instructed the maid to light beeswax candles near it each morning. Even so, the flies returned, and with them the rats. The servants refused to sleep in the lower quarters, claiming the scratching at night had worsened, that rats were nesting in the chute itself. When one scurried across Lady Aveline's slipper, one morning, shrieking echoed through the manor like thunder. In towns, privacy was a fantasy. Public privies were rare and expensive, often located near the market square or behind the town hall. They cost coin to use, and most of the poor either couldn't afford the toll or simply didn't see the point. Instead, alleys became open latrines. Men turned their backs discreetly, women squatted behind barrels, and the more daring relieved themselves beneath stairwells or against barn doors. Night soil men were paid to scoop excrement into carts and haul it out beyond the town walls. It was dangerous work, but necessary fires were discouraged, for the risk of igniting methane was real, and towns burned easily. One such night soil man, Callum, bore the scars of a collapsed pit he'd once fallen into. His left leg never quite straightened afterward, and he moved with a limp. Yet no one dared mock him. They needed him more than he needed them. Each week, Callum emptied the privy behind the butcher's shop, the one most townsfolk avoided due to its horrific stench and habit of attracting maggots. He wore thick gloves and stuffed dried mint into his nose, though even that did little. Over time, he came to believe that smell was the closest thing humans had to proof of sin. When a priest once blessed him for his humble labor, Callum had laughed so hard he wept. On feast days, when towns swelled with travelers and ale flowed like water, the problem worsened. Drunken men urinated wherever they pleased, vomit lined the streets, and children stepped over puddles with practiced ease. Diseases, already simmering in hidden corners, found such days a feast. Dysentery, typhoid, pax, all shared a common birth. In these moments of shared filth, castles offered no relief. The grandeur of noble architecture did not extend to hygiene. In some fortresses, the garderobe projected over the moat, a vertical shaft that allowed waste to drop into the water below. But in others, the shaft ended in a pit one that had to be emptied by hand every few years. In the worst of winters, when water froze and fires barely warmed the halls, the stench of these pits grew unbearable. No tapestry could mask it, no rosewater perfume could disguise its source. Knights returned from battle, covered in glory, only to relieve themselves over a hole in the stone floor like peasants. Back in the monastery, Brother Aldrich witnessed a miracle of sorts. One of the novice boys, Edric, had begun drawing diagrams in the dust schematics of wooden pipes, of covered channels that could carry waste farther from the river. When Aldrich asked him why, Edric shrugged. So it doesn't stink so much. He said simply. The idea caught on. Within a year, the monks had built a wooden aqueduct of sorts, diverting waste beyond the main bend of the river, where the current was swifter. It wasn't perfect, but it made a difference. Pilgrims who visited the priory began noting its cleanliness. Word spread in distant cities like Paris and London. Change came slowly. Laws were passed edicts forbidding the dumping of chamber pots from upper windows during daylight hours. Of course, after sunset, the rule was ignored. Cries of God warned passers-by to step aside before a window dumped its contents into the street below. Some began fashioning makeshift covers, but others remained defiant. Waste, to them, was a fact of life, not a problem to solve. Yet, even in this, ingenuity grew. A physician in Montpellier experimented with using sand in public latrines to cover waste and reduce odor. A noblewoman in Cologne hired a servant whose sole job was to refresh her chamber pot with dried herbs. In Venice, where water channels ran beneath the streets, engineers debated systems of sluices and gates to carry waste away with tidal currents. Some of these experiments failed spectacularly, flooding homes or poisoning wells. Others, surprisingly, worked, and slowly, generation by generation, the unthinkable began to happen. People noticed patterns, that the cleanest houses suffered, fewer fevers, that midwives like Magda saved more children. that monks who cleaned their rarer daughter lived longer, coughed less, walked straighter. Sanitation wasn't a word they knew, but they felt its touch, like sunlight through a storm cloud. And in that dark world of wood and stone and suffering, the seeds of something modern were being sown, not by kings or scholars, but by crippled latrine keepers, limp-legged night soil, men, children with chamber pots, and boys drawing lines in the dust. History would forget most of their names, but their stinking, back-breaking, thankless labor laid the first crooked bricks of a path we now walk with flushing toilets and clean hands. They would never know that centuries later, people would marvel, laugh, or shudder at what they endured. But maybe, just maybe, they'd be comforted to know we remembered. The wind howled through the crumbling alleyways of medieval London as dusk began to settle. Martha clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, stepping carefully over a stream of what she only half suspected to be rainwater. The alley stank of smoke, old beer, and something worse. A bucket overturned in the corner, leaking a thick brown sludge. No one even flinched as a rat scurried past, fat and confident. These were the smells and sights of daily life, but the thing weighing heaviest on Martha's mind wasn't the filth. In the streets, it was the question of where she could relieve herself with a shred of dignity. Again, behind her, the creaking door of her tenant house banged in the wind. 12 people crammed into one upper room, with no chamber pot left unbroken or unborrowed. She'd waited for hours, hoping someone would clean out the shared slop bucket in the corner. But it was now nearly full and smelled so violently that even the children cried when they had to squat over it. The truth was, Martha, like everyone else in this section of the city, had no real bathroom, no privacy, no dignity, just a shared corner, a piss pot, and the daily hope that the nightman hadn't forgotten his route. She hoisted the bucket carefully, turning her face away as she lifted it over the waste trench that ran parallel to the pigsty. It had been dug 2 winters ago by old Clem and his sons, intended originally for runoff water and kitchen scraps. But necessity changed everything. What once collected vegetable peels and wash water now overflowed with filth feces, urine, bile, and the occasional unidentifiable lump of something worse. The pigs didn't seem to mind. In fact, they clustered along the edge each morning, snorting at the fumes, rooting through the refuse. It was enough to twist Marjorie's stomach, but even so, this act was routine. Disgust had long since become background noise. From the far end of the alley, a voice barked her name. "Marjorie, that you, girl." It was Tom, the baker's apprentice, his thick arms dusted with flour, his face smudged with soot from the morning's fire. "Mistress wants the boards scrubbed. She says someone let fly in the corner again." Marjorie winced. The boards in question were laid out near the ovens, barely separated by a half curtain for privacy. Tom's words meant one of the night workers had squatted where they shouldn't, leaving her the delightful task of cleaning it before breakfast. "Be right in," she called back, setting the bucket down and wiping her hands on her apron as she walked. Her thoughts drifted to the more fortunate. She'd once been inside the manor house on a delivery, where she caught a glimpse of a real privy wooden seat and all, perched above a shaft that dropped straight into a pit below. There was even a carved wooden door for privacy. The steward had scolded her for dawdling, but that single glimpse stayed with her. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about dignity. Here, in Dunworth, no one had that luxury. Later that day, the stench followed her even into the chapel. The priest, Father Anselm, had taken to burning rosemary branches during Mass. not just for symbolism, but to mask the human stink that clung to every woolen tunic and homespun veil. Even God, it seemed, had to compete with the rot of medieval sanitation. But the worst was not the smell, it was the silence that accompanied it. No one complained. No one suggested change. It was as though everyone had agreed, silently, that this was simply how things were meant to be. Even when a child fell ill, when a woman miscarried, when the well was deemed sour for the third time that month, the villagers muttered prayers and went on. But one man, perhaps the only one, dared to speak against it. His name was Brother Elric, and he was not like the other monks. He was younger, his eyes burning with something between madness and vision. He had once studied in a city far south, where latrines were kept separate from kitchens, where water was diverted through clay pipes and soot was scrubbed from walls. He spoke of something called hygiene, a foreign-sounding word that made the other brothers scoff. But Elric had come to Dunworth with a mission to bring cleanliness to the village, and with it, salvation. He began small. He taught children to wash their hands, not just after defecating, but before meals, before prayer, before sleep. At first, the village mocked him. They had no soap, only ashes and lye. But he showed them how to make it. He even brought a bar himself, crumbling it in half and handing it to Marjorie one morning as she emptied her bucket. The hands that carry waste, he said, must be the cleanest of all. She was too stunned to reply. No one had ever said something like that to her before. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as filth, but as a person doing necessary work. Elric's influence grew. Soon, he began building things, primitive benches with holes over dugout pits, each one surrounded by woven reed walls for modesty. He called them field privies and encouraged their use far from water sources. He dug channels for waste to run downhill, away from homes. He even placed herbs, lavender, rosemary, and wild mint near the makeshift latrines to lessen the stench and discourage flies. But change breeds fear. Some villagers believed he was meddling in things that should be left alone. God made dirt, old Clem declared one night in the tavern, and its dirt will return to. No monk with southern airs is going to wash that away. That resistance took form. Someone smashed one of Elric's field privies with a hammer. Another morning, Marjorie found the soap barrels he'd left by the well emptied and filled with pig dung. Yet the monk persisted, and Marjorie found herself siding with him more and more. She even began helping him, despite the whispers that followed her in the market square. One particularly cold morning, a child was found dead near the trench. No one could say why. She was barely 6, her lips blue, her limbs stiff. Elric, in a fury, declared that disease had taken her hand, that the filth, the waste in the streets, the water near the waste trench, had poisoned her. The village divided in two that day. Those who believed him began building barriers between their homes and the trench. Others called him a heretic and a fearmonger. The priest offered no opinion. He only lit more rosemary. But Elric's voice could not be silenced. He began teaching about the flow of disease, though he had no word for it. He noticed that flies, which landed on waste, also landed on food, that people who lived nearest the trench grew sicker, that those who used his field privies were healthier. And his boldest act yet, he built a waste pit lined with clay and straw, far outside the village, a true latrine. He called it the sanctuary, and one day Marjorie followed him there to see it for herself. It was not beautiful, it was a pit, but it was safe, covered, private, dry. The stench was lessened by layers of ash, and for the first time in her life, Marjorie relieved herself with dignity, not hunched in an alley behind the pigs. And yet she knew war was coming. Not the kind fought with swords, but words, suspicion, and ignorance. She just didn't know how soon it would arrive. Lucas, leaning on a splintered gate, watched smoke spiral from the workshop chimneys of Dunworth as sunrise painted the sky in muted gold. The stink of yesterday's refuse still clung to the air, but there was movement. Now change. Across the fields, beyond the abbey streams and the village trenches, lay the sanctuary, Elric's new latrine. Standing over the covered pit lined with straw and ash, the monk whispered a blessing. May this sanctify our bodies and temper our souls. Marjorie, carrying water in a chipped bucket, stepped through the low wooden fence surrounding it. As she poured, she felt the weight of fear, knowing too well how fragile dignity could be. Word had spread quickly. Some villagers came out of curiosity, others out of necessity. When old Clem waddled over, his face grim but shoulders unbowed, and gave a curt nod of approval, Marjorie thought the battle was halfway won. But Lord Thomlin, the distant noble who technically owned Dunworth, rented field and manor land, and he was not pleased. Lords did not sanction latrines without walls of stone and ceilings of slate. A peasant-built privy disturbed the natural order, so began an invisible war. Elric taught children to carry water instead of lemons to the trench. Marjorie scrubbed board floors until they smelled of soap rather than sourness. The alehouse began rinsing mugs before refilling them. Even Father Anselm's sermons turned toward the virtues of clean water, even if he couched them in biblical language about the body being a temple. The change was slow, subtle, so slow half the villagers didn't notice until they fell ill. That winter was mild, but the coffin maker saw more of his trade than any year in living memory. Dysentery spread fast. Coughs echoed through the alleys. Some joked it was plague. Others whispered that divine wrath had returned. But Marjorie, wrapped in her wool cloak, no longer believed old wives' tales. She believed in water and soap, ash and distance, in simple measures that kept sickness at bay. When the first child using the sanctuary remained healthy while her siblings fell ill, things shifted. Mothers returned from fields to build their own small pits. Fathers dug trenches further from wells. Even Thomas, the baker's apprentice, brought water buckets to the trench site. He later admitted he did it to ease the smell before opening the bakery at dawn. But Marjorie suspected he'd been watching the results more than he'd let on. Lord Thomlin arrived mid-February, riding his bay gelding into the village, mist swirling around hooves, cloak trailing over dunk-streaked packhorse. He inspected the new field pit, frowned at its straw cover and simple wooden hinge. His steward, a pale-faced man with sharp eyes, had told him of radical hygiene. Lord Thomlin tapped his spiked boot against the fence, asked to speak with the monks. Brother Elric stepped forward, bareheaded, robes thin but eyes steady. The Lord's voice was cold. "Your latrine sits on land I own," he said. "I demand it be dismantled." Elric bowed, hands pressed together. "My lord, it is built on donated field by villagers seeking health." The Lord spat. "Health or arrogance? We are not Romans, monk." Elric didn't flinch. "Fecal illness kills," he said simply. "We need this." The standoff could have turned violent, but Marjorie stepped forward. She spoke of her son for summers gone who nearly died. She spoke of old Clem and his cough from where the trench backed against his door. She spoke simply and humbly. When she finished, the fog drifted away, and Lord Thomlin rode off, stewing. He gave permission. With conditions, the pit must be covered, distant from the river, deep enough that smell would not rise. The first time young Aldrich saw the inside of a noble's privy, he thought it was some kind of altar. A cold, stone slab cut with a hole, high above the castle gardens, hidden behind an oaken door with iron bands. There was no candle, no decoration, not even straw, just a hole that fell into darkness, and a smell like old soup left to die. He was 7, the scullery maid's boy, too small to scrub pots, but not too small to carry messages between floors. The kitchen steward sent him up to Lord Geoffrey's solar with a plate of sweetmeats and a jug of watered wine. But he arrived. Too early, too fast, before the Lord had finished his business. That was Aldrich's first encounter with a real medieval bathroom, and it marked him, not for its majesty, but for its quiet horror. To the modern mind, a bathroom is a place of relief, of privacy, of white porcelain and clean tiles. In the medieval world, it was something altogether different. A bathroom was a corner of the world where waste and class collided. There was no toilet paper, no running water, and certainly no fan to pull the smell away. There were just people, some rich, some poor, all very human, dealing with the most basic, most humbling function of existence, waste. For the nobles, like Lord Geoffrey, the answer was the garderobe, a small room built into the thick outer wall of a castle, with a seat cut into stone or wood. The hall beneath emptied directly outside, often down a chute, sometimes into the moat, sometimes into a pit. In the best cases, a servant would dump lime into the trench to fight the stench. In the worst cases, when the wind blew wrong or the waste pit overflowed, created a reek so foul it could be smelled from the kitchens to floors below. Yet, despite the discomfort, the garderobe was considered a luxury. Only the wealthy had a space reserved for defecation. The poor, they had the fields, or, worse, the ditch behind the alehouse. Aldrich's mother, Maeve, was a washerwoman with crooked fingers and a permanently reddened face from years of scrubbing linen in boiling water. She had no toilet in her home, no hole, no seat, no privacy. In their small lean-to behind the castle kitchens, they used a bucket at night. During the day, they waited for the call of nature to come when they were outside, in the garden, if they were lucky, or the alley, if they weren't. The waste was dumped into a cesspit dug behind the kitchens. The cesspit never fully dried. Even in winter, it steamed in this world. Bodily functions weren't discussed. They were endured. There were no euphemisms. You didn't say you were using the bathroom. You said nothing. You went, and you hoped no one noticed. Especially not the reeve, who might fine you for fouling public ground. Still, not all privies were created equal. At the Benedictine Abbey up the hill, the monks had a different system. Their latrines, called reredautors, were long benches with multiple holes built over running water. The theory was simple: use the force of nature to carry waste away. The stream below the abbey was redirected to pass under the stone trench, washing away the monks' sins and their stools in one go. It was ingenious, and yet it did little to eliminate the smell which clung to the stones year-round. Brother Hallett, a round-faced monk with a gift for illumination, wrote in his journal that the Lord did not intend us to breathe holiness from our backsides. He once tried to burn incense during his time in the reredaughter, hoping to sanctify the air. The incense caught a dry reed mat on fire, and half the monk's robes were lost to the blaze. Since then, silence and swiftness became the new rule. In the latrines, But even monks had dignity. In the villages beyond the castle walls, where peasants lived 10 to a room and drank from the same stream they soiled, sanitation was less structured. In times of flood, latrines overflowed. In times of drought, waste baked in the sun. Children ran barefoot through alleyways spotted with waste. Dogs dragged bones from trenches. And when the wind shifted, the smell of unwashed humanity rolled over the land like a fog. Aldrich learned quickly to breathe through his mouth in certain streets. By the time he was 10, he'd joined the night soil crew. Every castle and town had one, a team of men, sometimes boys, who were under cover of darkness, went house to house, cart to cart, collecting waste, human waste. It was their job to empty the chamber pots, clean the trenches, and if required, dig new cesspits. They were paid in coin and rotgut ale. No one spoke to them during the day. They were invisible, unless someone complained that the smell had returned. Aldrich didn't mind the work. It kept his mother fed and kept him close to the castle kitchens, where sometimes, if no one was looking, he could snatch a crust of bread or a turnip half-eaten by the steward. He grew used to the stink. It became background, like the clink of armor or the mutter of Latin. But there were moments that stayed with him. One night they were called to the manor of Lady Jezebel, a noble woman known for her velvet gloves and perpetual frown. Her privy had backed up, a clog in the chute. The stench had reached her bedchamber, and she refused to sleep until it was resolved. Aldrich's crew spent hours digging through the muck beneath the garderobe tower, searching for the blockage. They found it, a ring gold, heavy, set with a stone the color of winter frost. It had fallen from her hand while she sat above. No doubt she had screamed when it dropped, but too embarrassed to say how it was lost. Now it lay here, nestled in the filth of 100 other nights. Aldrich washed it in the stream, scrubbed it with sand, and returned it the next morning. She didn't thank him, just took it with a wrinkled nose and turned away. That was the thing about medieval bathrooms. They revealed everyone. No matter how rich, how pious, how proud, every man and woman eventually sat on a hole and waited. And in that moment, they were just human. Some embraced that humility. Others pretended it didn't exist. Then came the day Aldrich turned 15 and was offered a job inside the keep itself. No more night soil, no more trenches. He would tend to Lord Geoffrey's private garderobe, clean it, scrub the stone, collect the waste bucket and dispose of it outside the walls. He accepted. The first time he entered that small, freezing room alone, he paused, touched the stone, stared down the chute. It was all so ... quiet in time. He became the keeper of the castle's most private secrets. He learned which nobles ate too many figs, which guests tried to hide blood in the rushes, which servants snuck in for a moment of privacy during a busy feast. He kept their secrets because they weren't truly secrets, they were truths, too embarrassing to admit. But the job had dangers. One winter, a traveling priest fell through the rotted wood of a latrine. Seaton cracked his leg on the chute wall. He died a week later of fever. Another time, a page leaned too far over a frozen trench and was lost to the ice. And always, there was the risk of plague. Human waste carried disease. When the Black Death came, they said it travelled by air, by rats, by sin. But Aldrich knew it came from filth, from unclean hands and stagnant pits. His night soil crew died first, one by one, until only Aldrich remained. He took to burning lime by the trench, washing his hands in vinegar, covering his face with cloth soaked in herbs. It didn't save his mother. She died in their hut, in the dark, and he buried her with the rushes still, clinging to her hair. After that, Aldrich changed. He built a small seat outside the keep, far from the walls, with a bucket beneath and a curtain above. He used it only at dawn, before the castle stirred. Some mocked him, but Lord Geoffrey did not. He asked Aldrich to build one for him as well. And slowly, word spread. By the end of the decade, every noble in the region had a separate privy, some with scented rushes, others with padded seats. One lord commissioned a chair carved from cedar, its hole lined with copper. Aldrich laughed when he saw it, and yet something had changed. Bathrooms primitive, filthy, open were slowly becoming private. Not for all. The peasants still squatted in fields. The monks still shared their daughter, but a seed had been planted. One day, perhaps, there would be porcelain, water that flowed, rooms that locked. But for now, it was enough to have a curtain, a single sheet of linen between a man and the world, and Aldrich. He remained the keeper of that curtain, even as an old man, walking with a cane made from a broken shovel. He was the one people whispered to when a new seat needed carving, when a trench needed redigging, when someone dropped something important into a place they dared not name. He never laughed, he just nodded, lit a torch, and followed the smell. The silence of the priory was deceptive. Behind thick stone walls, the echoes of shuffling feet and whispers wove around torchlit corridors where monks paced, heads bowed beneath hoods, lives devoted to silence, penance, and most curiously latrines. Brother Aldrich, elderly and half-crippled, from a poorly healed injury in youth, was keeper of the Reredota, the communal latrine of the Benedictine monastery perched above the river. Why? His days were spent maintaining a system the outside world barely knew existed, hidden, pungent, artery of medieval monastic life. Meanwhile, in the manor just a half-mile away, Sir Aldwin eased back onto a padded oak bench, the embroidered cushions rustling under him. The wooden seat, carefully carved with ivy motifs, had a circular hole in the center, beneath which lay a deep shaft lined with stone. It was one of the few garderobes in the region, and to Sir Aldwin it was both a convenience and a status symbol. The shaft extended downward, emptying into a section of the castle's dry moat, a design meant to allow gravity to do most of the unpleasant work. But during summer months, when water was low and flies were many, the stench climbed back up like a ghost seeking revenge. His wife, Lady Jezebel, had taken to burning dried lavender at the base of the shaft, claiming it kept the demons out. Privately, Aldwin suspected it only made the smell worse. Back in the city, the concept of a garderobe might as well have been myth. Martha walked along the darkening alley until she reached a wooden platform hanging precariously over the Thames. Several other women stood there already, skirts lifted discreetly, peering nervously over their shoulders. The platform privy had been built by a group of local wives, tired of being heckled while squatting in doorways. It was a crude solution, a series of planks, nailed together and suspended over the river by ropes and faith. But it offered a sliver of privacy and the pretense of sanitation. Waste fell directly into the water below, joining a frothy mixture of fish bones, pig entrails, and dye runoff from the nearby cloth district. Martha stepped forward, shoes slick on the wood, heart pounding. She hated this part, not the act itself, but the risk of being seen, of slipping, or worse, of being followed. A girl had disappeared from this very spot a month ago. Rumors whispered that she had slipped and drowned. Others said a man had pulled her in. No one knew for certain, and no one looked too hard for answers. People vanished in the night all the time. Just like full chamber pots, they were part of the scenery at the monastery on the hill. Brother Elric paced the cloistered walk, his hands folded under his sleeves. He had just come from cleaning the latrine trench, a sacred duty that fell to the youngest novitiates. The monastic reredaughter sat behind the dormitory. A row of stone seats above a long channel of water diverted from a nearby stream. Gravity carried the waste away, in theory, but in colder months the flow slowed, freezing at times, leaving waste to pile and rot. Brother Elric had nearly fainted from the fumes that morning, and yet it was considered more sanitary than anything in the village. The monks had written manuscripts explaining the benefits of flowing water beneath privy seats, suggesting it was a gift from God to be mimicked whenever possible. Inside the tanner's workshop, things were worse. Much worse. Leather required, urine to soften the hides, and so vats of it lined the walls, steaming gently. Tanners were allowed, even encouraged, to collect urine from public sources. Little boys were paid a coin to fill jugs and deliver them. Pisspots sat openly on street corners, labelled for the tanner, and it was not uncommon for someone to relieve themselves directly into one. The smell was so pungent it could be tasted in the air. The tanner's apprentice, a thin boy named Jory, had lost all sense of smell months ago. He worked the hides with bare hands, laughing as newcomers gagged. To him, it was just work. To visitors, it was hell. The noble court, meanwhile, found other ways to disguise the human body's inconveniences. Servants carried ornate chamber, pots from room to room, often covered in linen or painted with gold filigree. The wealthy urinated and defecated behind silk screens or in curtained corners, while musicians played to drown out the sound. In Queen Isabel's court, it was fashionable to carry perfumed pomanders to the privy, which were held to the nose during the act. They called it elegance, but the servants, the ones who emptied the pots, knew better. In the dead of night, long after the nobles had retired, these pots were carried to dumping points outside the city gates. If one servant missed their duty, the stench would fester by morning. Punishments were swift and never public. No one wanted to speak openly about waste at the edge of the village. Old Folk hobbled toward his hut, a crooked thing built from wattle and daub, its roof sinking like a sigh. He had no privy, no bucket, no pot. Only a worn spot behind the goat pen where he squatted each day, hoping the animals wouldn't wander too close. He used dried grass to wipe, or snow in winter. Folk's neighbours called him mad, but they occasionally copied his technique when too poor to afford straw or linen rags. He once told Martha, laughing, that he remembered a time when people believed rubbing ash on the backside would prevent disease. She wasn't sure if he was joking, but that was the thing. No one really knew. People passed down ideas of cleanliness, like they passed down curses. Some said you should never relieve yourself facing the moon. Others swore that urinating on a cat would bring bad luck. Children were taught to avoid defecating near water sources, not because of hygiene, but because it angered the spirits. In the absence of science, superstition ruled the chamber pot. And then there were the brave or desperate souls who made their living cleaning the cesspits, hauling barrels of human waste through the streets in darkness. They were shunned, reviled, even feared, yet without them, entire districts would drown in their own filth. Gregory was one such man, barrel-chested and silent. He worked alone, his cart piled high with tightly sealed containers. At dawn, he dumped them outside the city walls, where they soaked into the ground or were burned. Once, when a child mocked him, he turned and said only this: "Better my hands dirty than your floor." As the years passed, privy pits collapsed, causing entire homes to tilt or sink. Disease crept in: dysentery, typhoid, and worse. Physicians wrote frantic letters about sanitation, but few read them and fewer cared. Martha caught a fever one winter and nearly died. Her neighbors said it was the damp. Her mother said it was punishment for washing during Holy Week. No one suspected the flies from the overflowing slop bucket in the manor. Sir Aldwyn's garderobe cracked in a frost, and for a week his family used a gilded bucket by the hearth. Lady Jezebel wept at the indignity, claiming she could feel herself becoming a peasant. Aldwyn scoffed, but when the chambermaid tripped, carrying the full bucket, spilling its contents across the drawing room, even he gagged. "It's like living among beasts," Jezebel whispered. But in truth, the line between manor and hovel was thinner than they dared admit when the new cathedral was built. It included public latrines, vast ones, with stone seats and open channels below. The bishop declared it a triumph of Christian charity, but the peasants whispered that it was haunted. They claimed you could hear groaning from the shafts, and that one boy had been pulled down by a spirit. The reality was simpler. The shafts were deep and echoing, and a man who fell in might never climb back out. Gregory once found a body in one. He didn't speak of it again, and still the people relieved themselves where they could, in alleys, in rivers, behind doors, in pots carried from room to room, with cloth, with grass, with nothing. It was part of life. And when Martha finally saved enough coins to buy a second-hand chamber pot of her own, cracked and chipped, but hers, she felt a strange pride. She hid it under her bed like a treasure. She cleaned it daily. She even gave it a name, Mercy, because in a world where dignity was rare and privacy rarer still, something as simple as a pot could feel like salvation, while the upper crust of medieval society had the luxury of private garderobes or even cushioned chamber pots. The everyday peasant experienced a vastly different reality. For the villagers of southern England, for example, where the thatched roofs clung to crumbling timber frames and the streets were little more than foot-worn mud paths, bathroom habits were dictated not by convenience but by pure necessity. In the hamlet of Alderbrook, a man named Hugh, an aging blacksmith whose hands were calloused and stained from decades of soot and iron, started each day before the sun rose. But before the forge could roar to life, there was always the same grim ritual: the walk to the communal pit. This pit, dug behind the animal pens near the edge of the village, was nothing more than a deep hole in the earth surrounded by leaning wooden planks meant to provide some semblance of privacy. It stank even in winter, but in the humid summer months it became nearly unbearable. Children dared each other to linger near it. Dogs nosed around for scraps. Flies claimed it like a kingdom. And yet it was where men like Hugh relieved themselves, a place that bore silent witness to centuries of human need and indignity. Not everyone ventured out there. Women, particularly older ones, often relied on chamber pots, indoors, squat. Wide-bellied vessels that, once filled, had to be discreetly emptied, usually in a trench or stream. In households like that of Matilda, a widow who lived with her 2 daughters and 3 goats in a single-room hut, the pot sat in the farthest corner, partially concealed by a hanging cloth. It was used at night or during storms when trudging. Outside wasn't safe, but the girls hated emptying it. The walk to the dumping spot behind the well was filled with the same dread every time. The hot reek, the sloshing weight, and the risk of tripping on roots or rocks in the path and spilling. The entire mess across one's skirt. In wealthier estates, servants bore the brunt of sanitation duties. Young boys like Alric, a page at Lord Hatherless Manor, learned quickly that tending to the closet was as much a part of his role as polishing armor or fetching wine. The castle's garderobe jutted out over the edge of the wall, high above the moat. Waste dropped freely from a narrow seat into the water below, which only partially washed it away. Ulrich was taught to throw lime down the shaft every few days, to keep the stink down, though it did little. Once, during a winter freeze, the moat iced over entirely, and Ulrich witnessed a servant boy slip while trying to chip away at the hardened filth that had frozen in place along the stonework. The concept of privacy, at least by modern standards, was almost non-existent. In larger cities, like York or London, communal latrines were a necessity. Public bathhouses often doubled as toilet spots, the floor channels carrying away both bathwater and human waste into nearby rivers. These bathhouses became places of unexpected social dynamics, laborers sitting side by side with merchants, their shared discomfort and bodily functions, an awkward equalizer. A young apprentice named Tom once described to a traveling friar how men would chat about politics while defecating over holes in a shared bench, the smell only slightly masked by bundles of herbs hung nearby. Then there were the castles, grand and towering, yes, but not immune to the challenges of medieval plumbing. In Castle Ferndale, a serving maid named Isolde discovered firsthand how little separated nobility from the raw physicality of life. She was instructed to clean the Queen's chamber pot, a silver-lined, jewel-adorned vessel that was revered more for its decoration than its purpose. It had to be emptied daily, washed with wine or vinegar, and returned with fresh linens folded neatly beside it. One day, Isolde dropped it. The sound of metal on stone rang through the corridor like a bell tolling doom. The pot dented, and she feared dismissal or worse. But the Queen, upon hearing of the incident, merely chuckled and said, "Well, perhaps it will remind me I'm still mortal." That remark spread through the castle, and for weeks the servants spoke of it as if it were a parable. Urban centres faced different issues. The streets of medieval Paris, for instance, were often littered with human waste. Residents would dump chamber pots out of upper-story windows with the warning cry, "Gardes low, watch out for the water." This did little to protect the poor soul below, who might be struck by a stream of refuse while strolling home from market. A cobbler named Etienne was known in his neighborhood for carrying a wooden board above his head. During his daily walks, not out of eccentricity, but as a shield. Once, he was struck directly in the face by a tenant's night soil and swore never to go out without protection again. The board became his trademark, and eventually, children imitated him for sport. In the countryside, things could be marginally cleaner, depending on the season. During spring and summer, people sometimes used the fields or woods, squatting among the tall grass or behind trees. This was particularly common during festivals or traveling pilgrimages. At the annual midsummer gathering near the River Wye, thousands of villagers converged to trade goods, hear sermons, and dance. But the absence of designated toilet areas turned the surrounding forest into an unofficial lavatory. The stench rose with the heat. By the end of the week, complaints mounted, and a local priest claimed it was a sign of divine displeasure. He began offering a sermon titled Cleanliness and the Soul, which went ignored by nearly everyone, even monasteries. Those bastions of order and spiritual purity struggled with the logistics of human waste. Monks in the Abbey of Crowhurst relied on a latrine house built over a flowing stream, part of an early attempt at sanitation. The structure included a long bench with multiple holes, and monks entered in shifts according to a strict schedule. Silence was enforced, even here. Brother Elfric once sneezed while relieving himself and was assigned extra prayers for breaking the sanctity of the moment. However, the stream was not always reliable. During droughts, waste would build up beneath the bench, forcing the monks to dig manually and carry the filth away in carts. It was in these moments that even the most devout questioned their vow of obedience. Sickness often forced new innovations, although none were particularly effective. During a bout of dysentery that swept through a northern village, midwives began experimenting with lined pits filled with ash to absorb liquid waste. The idea was crude but somewhat functional. The village elder, Edric, ordered that every family build one behind their home. The rule was enforced with fines of grain or labor, and within a month, reports of foul runoff reaching the well decreased. Edric later boasted that their village had the cleanest arses this side of the kingdom, a line still quoted by his descendants long after his death. Children were largely left to their own devices when it came to bathroom habits. Toddlers went where they stood, and older children used the same facilities as adults. Accidents were common and rarely scolded. In one touching account from a diary found in the ruins of a manor, a servant named Ada recounted how the lord's youngest son, still no older than 4, soiled himself during a feast. The embarrassed child was gently cleaned by his nursemaid, and the Lord remarked, "Better to lose dignity young than never find it at all." Ada found the sentiment moving enough to record it, though the page was later stained with water damage and mildew. It is tempting to view these medieval practices with contempt or ridicule, but for those who lived through them, it was simply the texture of life. Bodily functions were not taboo, they were facts. The dignity people managed to retain in the face of such indignities spoke volumes about their resilience. Even in the worst conditions, the overflowing pits, the chamber pots that shattered, the latrines that collapsed into frozen rivers, there remained a kind of grim humor. People joked about it. They survived it. And, perhaps most importantly, they adapted. As for Hugh, the blacksmith, in his final years, he dug a second pit, this time just behind his workshop, fenced with fresh timber and covered with a slanted roof. It became known as Hugh's Throne, and other villagers came to admire its sturdiness. Children whispered that it was the cleanest latrine in all of Alderbrook. When Hugh passed, a wooden plaque was nailed above it, reading simply, "Here sat a man who understood comfort." And in that small tribute, perhaps the entire spirit of medieval sanitation was captured, a stubborn pursuit of dignity, even in the messiest of circumstances. As dawn broke over the thatched rooftops of the medieval town of Wickenford, a thin layer of mist clung stubbornly to the cobbled streets, curling around boots and bare feet alike. Life began early, even on damp, grey mornings like this, and with it came the humdrum rituals of the day ones that modern minds would struggle to imagine, particularly the bathroom routines of the villagers. Eleanor, the baker's wife, rose, first in her household, as she always did. The faint pre-dawn light filtered through the wall-stuffed window slats, barely illuminating the single-room cottage she shared with her husband Thomas and their 2 small children. The straw beneath. Her back crunched faintly as she shifted, pushing off the coarse woolen blanket. Her bladder, aching from the night, reminded her that nature's call waited for no one. Silently, she reached beneath the bed, her fingers curling around the familiar wooden rim of the chamber pot. It was still warm from Thomas's use earlier. That morning there was no privacy in a home like theirs. No separate room, no screen, not even a curtain. Just the shared understanding that in a world where comfort was a luxury, dignity had a different definition. She used the pot with practiced speed, set it aside carefully, and began her morning. Later, she would empty it into the waste channel that ran along the middle of their narrow street, a small trench lined with stone and rank with the stench of communal discharge. It was the designated runnel, as everyone called it, where waste flowed down toward the stream outside the town, hopefully washing away with the next rain. Hopefully. But there was more to the medieval bathroom than chamber pots and open trenches. In the manor house on the hill, a different story played out that morning. Lady Iseldine, daughter of a minor noble and widow of the late Sir Corbin of Wickhamford, rang the small brass bell beside her bedchamber. It summoned her handmaid Honora, who bustled in with a basin of water, lukewarm at best and a linen towel, fraying at the edges. "Fetch my robe," Iseldine instructed, her voice groggy but stern. "And the perfume, that lavender vinegar I favour." Honora nodded and obeyed, then helped her mistress wash her face, her hands, and behind her ears with careful dabs. Even among the higher-born, full-body bathing was rare. To immerse oneself in water too often was considered dangerous, a belief born from a mix of religious caution and humoral medicine. Water, especially warm, was thought to open the skin and allow illness to enter. But Lady Iseldine was fortunate. Her manor had a garderobe, vertical shaft connected to a seat that jutted out from the castle wall, allowing waste to fall directly into a pit or the moat below. Cold wind always whooshed up the chute, especially in the winter, giving the experience an unforgettable chill. The seat was carved from oak, polished by years of use, and Iseldine used it only rarely, preferring, like many nobles, to use a close stool, a portable commode disguised as a chair with a removable pot inside. Her favourite one had velvet upholstery on the arms, though it had begun to smell faintly of mildew. Back in the town, however, the poor had fewer options. Ralph the tanner, whose hut sat close to the town's southern entrance, worked with urine. Every day, literally, human urine was collected by tanners and used to treat leather. Buckets marked for piss-pot collection sat outside homes, and Ralph would send his boy Jory to collect them twice a week. Jory hated it, always wrinkling his nose as he poured yellow sloshing contents into barrels in the shop. But Ralph had long since stopped noticing the smell. It was part of the work, and work meant survival. Not all waste was discarded into the street. Many cottages had middens, simple, foul-smelling pits dug into backyards where human and animal waste, food scraps, and other refuse were thrown. These would sometimes overflow, attracting flies, rats, and worse. The church tried to enforce regulations about cleanliness, particularly on holy grounds, but in practice these efforts were as porous as the walls of the town itself. Priests, too, had their routines. Father Elric, the rotund parish priest, took pride in his small cloister chamber in the rear of the stone chapel. It contained a wooden seat with a pot beneath, emptied once a week by a hired hand. Monks in larger monasteries had communal latrines, benches with holes carved at regular intervals, beneath which ran water channels if the monastery was wealthy enough to have plumbing. Some abbeys even had early versions of flushing systems, using rainwater collected in cisterns, a marvel too. Those used to outhouses and ditches, but even the most refined systems did not erase the ever-present stink of medieval life. The air in Wickenford was thick with it, especially by midday. Sun warmed the cobblestones, awakening every fetid note of waste, decay, and livestock. Visitors often commented that the town smelled of its own sins. Those who could afford to escape the smell often did so with pomander spheres filled with herbs, flowers, or vinegar-soaked cloth hung from belts or worn around the neck. Children sometimes wore them, too, to ward off bad airs, thought to carry disease. Marjorie, a young girl of 9, played near the washing brook with her sister until she stumbled and cut her hand on a shard of broken crockery. Blood dripped onto the grass. Their mother, seeing the wound, rushed over and wrapped it quickly in a linen scrap. They had no ointment, only superstition and prayers. The stream was cleaner than most sources, but still untrustworthy. Disease was everywhere, and it often entered the body through unseen paths. By evening, the streets were wet again, not from rain, but from the buckets of waste and grey water thrown from windows. Cries of Gardes, lo, literally, watch out for the water, rang out before each splash, though few truly watched. It was safer to walk close to the buildings, beneath the overhangs. Avoiding the gutters and their sluggish contents, one of the town's oldest residents, old Mar, sat near the church steps with a pipe in his mouth, one eye clouded over from cataract. He told tales to the children who dared approach him, especially about the time when a noble visiting from France brought a bathhouse wagon in, entire cart converted into a portable sauna. Merrick claimed to have seen steam rising from its roof, and said the nobles smelled like roses for days. Most didn't believe him, but no one could prove him wrong. In the Guildhall, the barber surgeon prepared his tools for the next day: razors, leeches, and a wide-bowled pot for bloodletting. Few people came to him for actual surgery, but many came for supposed cures, including enemas administered with syringes made of horn and leather. It was believed that purging the bowels could correct imbalances in the humours. So yes, enemas were not only common, they were prescribed. Back at the manor, Lady Iseldine sat writing a letter by candlelight. She had received word of a new bathhouse being constructed in Winchester, built near a warm spring. Supposedly, it had tiled floors and heated stones, modelled after ancient Roman styles. She smiled faintly at the thought. Perhaps the past had known more than the present gave it credit for. Perhaps, she mused, the Romans understood the value of clean water and warm steam. In Wickenford, the luxuries of Rome were distant memories, whispered only in the crumbling remains of old roads and ruined aqueducts. Honora returned to her chamber to sleep, curling beneath a worn wool blanket near the hearth. The manor was cold in its stone bones, and the wind crept through the arrow slits with whispers of frost. Somewhere outside, a fox howled. She thought of the chamber pots she'd emptied today, the sour smell that still clung to her skin. She thought, too, of the little boy who'd died last week of dysentery, the one whose mother had prayed so hard for healing. In the morning, the whole routine would begin again. More chamber pots, more runnels, more waste tossed into the alleys. But this was life, as it had always been. Medieval bathrooms were not rooms at all, but a daily negotiation between necessity and invention, filth and ritual. The act of relieving oneself was woven into the architecture of survival, painted in odours, etched in stone, and quietly endured. Yet, Amid the grime, there was a strange kind of order, a system built from need, shaped by scarcity and preserved by repetition. It was not glamorous, not sanitary by modern standards, but it was theirs. They knew its rules and made peace with its shortcomings, because, in the end, they had no choice. And as the town of Wickenford slept beneath a cloudy sky, its people curled, beneath blankets, chamber pots, beneath beds, with dreams no different than our own, of warmth, of health, and maybe, just maybe, of something better beyond the filth. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern hills of Graham when the first clatter of buckets and urgency stirred the sleeping streets. Old Winner, the night soil collector, stomped down the alley with his cart, the wooden wheels banging against cobblestones slick from the night's mist. He wore a patched leather apron protected by remnants of moss and grime, each crack serving as a testament to the countless chamber, pots both clay and metal, that he'd emptied under the mantle of darkness. For some, he was a nuisance, for others, a lifeline. Without him, the entire district would drown in its own refuse. Festering into disease and despair, nearby, in a modest Tudor-arched doorway, lived Isabel and her apprentice daughter, Marigold. Their cottage was cramped, housing no more than 2 people and 3 stray kittens. Inside, a single wooden pot sat in the corner, kept covered with a cloth, stiffened by lime to reduce odor. The potted plant on the small windowsill, a sprig of scented rosemaries, served double duty, herbal fragrance and insect repellent. Each morning, Isabel would rise before dawn, lift the pot gently, and carry it out behind the house. Once emptied, into a deep pit, she'd sprinkle ash into it, her face lined with concentration. "It's ash," she whispered to Marigold, "not magic, but it saves us from sickness." Marigold, wide-eyed, nodded and helped toss logs onto the hearth's fire. Not yet old enough to carry the weight of ritual alone. Meanwhile, in the village square, the parish priest, Father Aldwin, served as both spiritual shepherd and arbiter of cleanliness. He maintained a small lavatory attached to the church's rear wall, a gift from a wealthy patron wishing to earn favor in the afterlife. The seat was fashioned from oak, rough-hewn but sturdy, with a chute leading directly into a lined pit. On Sundays, Father Aldwin would lock the door after morning mass and spend a quiet hour washing his hands in a brass basin, eyes closed in prayer. He believed in what he called respectable disposal, a holiness married to practicality. He often lectured the villagers gently. When you care for your body's waste, you honor the body that God gave you. Few understood, fewer practiced, but the idea lingered beyond the village. The manor of Sir Holcombe sat atop a green rise, looming over greener fields. It was here that Sir Holcombe, a stern yet curious man, experimented with sanitation on a scale unheard of. He'd studied abroad in Italy, where public baths and early flush turrets were more common. Inspired, he ordered his masons to carve stone conduits beneath the castle's walls to carry waste away using rainwater channels. His garderobe seats were placed over these conduits, and in one corner he installed a cistern that collected rainwater for washing. Servants carried pans of clean water to the seats, emptied from a well deep in the courtyard. It wasn't perfect plumbing, was crude, leaks frequent, but it worked often enough, and the smell in the winter gardens wasn't nearly as rancid as in other estates. However, innovation had its costs. One frosty night, the channels froze solid. Waste backed up, then overflowed into the castle kitchens. The resulting chaos scorched a cook's robes and led to days of rancid stew. Guest chatter that week centered not around feasts, but about the new sanitation system gone haywire. Humiliation followed innovation like a shadow. Sir Holcomb redoubled efforts, installing wooden lids and thicker conduits, though he never let go of his vision for cleaner living. Close to the market slope, the bustling blacksmith's forge offered another glimpse into medieval bathroom life. Thomas, the smith, worked steel by day, shaping horseshoes and blades in the hiss of steam and clink of hammer. At night, he was a man of simple needs: sleep, food, and relief. He used a chamber pot, but only rarely, preferring the privacy of the rolling hills beyond his smithy. The walk was dark and cold, but clean, and he spoke often of the peace it brought him. Better a cold stone underfoot than foul breath in your lungs, he told his apprentice. The boy nodded, pressing a rag into his ear, as though the lesson in silence was more than just about smell in the heart of the town. The apothecary's shop carried its own peculiar charm. When Anselm, the apothecary, inherited the space from his father, he discovered a hidden chamber, small latrine, inconspicuously tucked behind a false wall. In curiosity, he tapped a groove. The wooden panel fell inward, and there it was, a stone seat with a shallow trough beneath, drained into a remote pit beside the foundations. No one knew how old it was. Anselm cleaned it carefully, lining the trough with moss and pottery shards. He used it only once, to test whether time burned in water could mask odor. He kept the chamber pot mostly for his customers, who used it when seeking cures for digestion or bile. "Taste the herbs I offer," he said softly, "but first, cleanse your own vessel." In the local mill, women would queue with bowls and small pots, taking turns at a wooden platform overlooking the mill racer flowing stream, pushing between paddles and stones. They whispered gossip as they relieved themselves, the hum of grinding, grain a backdrop to their private talk. The miller, an old woman named Brynhild, sold the waste as fertilizer to nearby farmers, the human equivalent of blood and bones. It was barter no one admitted to. Yet, in Richard's field, across the river, the wheat was tall, golden dot as dusk fell. Children laughed and chased each other toward the town's edge. Along the worn path, they paused at the open latrina stone bench with 3 holes behind. The Lord's storehouse. It was a public toilet of sorts, but only used by travellers, pilgrims, and occasionally the stout butcher when he'd had too much ale. It smelled sharply of cedar chips and lime. The children dared each other to peek under the seat. One scraped his finger on the rough stone, but only squealed when a small snake slithered past. They fled as if chased by memory itself. Later, in the quiet of the night, Martha, who had long since earned enough coin to buy a chamber pot of her own, sat by her hearth, cradling the chipped vessel she'd named Mercy. She held it as if it were a newborn. She considered its presence in her home not as sign of filth, but resilience. She whispered to it in the candlelight, "You stand between me and shame." She trimmed a scrap of linen for a cover, washed it gently in lavender water, and set it beside her bed. When she slept, she dreamt of a world where Mercy's cousins' rooms, with locks on doors, running water, quiet hum of a flush, were not impossible fantasies, but everyday life. And across the countryside, from the humble piggery to the grand castle, from public stink pits to carefully lined conduits, the human desire for cleanliness, privacy, and dignity nudged the world forward spark by spark, pot by pot, because, in those early stinking chapters of history, people discovered something vital: the difference between survival and comfort. The rest the porcelain, the plumbing, the porcelain. Throne would come much later. But medieval bathrooms, there where our story began, as evening settled in Wickenford, the amber glow of lamps cast long shadows along the narrow alley where stone met wood, and together held centuries of filth and toil. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of bread baking mingling with the lingering stench of refuse. The ritual of the night soil man, old Winner, had ended. But another routine began. Chamber pots were carefully carried to the eaves, basin by basin, the liquid trickling into the street below. Cries of Gardes, low, still echoed in the darkness as wares were lowered from windows waste. Yes, but also water that had washed dishes or faces. No distinction was made in medieval nights at the manor house. Sir Holcombe paced behind his solar, wrapped in a wool cloak. He paused at the doorway of his private garderobe, modest wooden seat over a cistern, contemplating how far his experimental plumbing had taken him. The conduit system still groaned with each thunderstorm, shifting stones and spilling waste into hidden pipes. His gardener Moose placed a bowl of rainwater at the seat's side half for washing, half to catch drips. Behind the seat, ivy claimed the stone wall, its tendrils curled as if touching something below. In the silence, Moose's soft snore came from beyond a curtained screen. The night watch at the marvellous invention Sir Holcombe had installed. Silence, though, was an illusion. In the servants' quarters below, Margaret tended to chamber. Pots collected that evening. The servants' passageway smelled of old moss and damp. Margaret moved quickly, internalizing a choreography of tacks, soap, rinse, rinse again, cover, stack. She murmured prayers under her breath. Please, let no one spill tonight. The castle's stone floor was cold, and the candle she held spluttered. When she passed the draught beneath the garderobe, she always looked up at that purple velvet curtain separating nobility from labour. She'd learned to bow to it in her mind quickly, carefully knowing that beyond, waste and dignity were separate worlds. Outside town, the rural roads gave birth to quiet confidence. Some travellers set up travelling privies folding wooden. Benches carried on wagon wheels. They offered privacy, yes, but only in daylight. At night, they dwindled into lonely wooden boxes with locking lids. Should someone knock, the traveller would return later, touching neither door nor pot until dawn. There, they shared the silence of night and the comfort of daylighted dignity. In the marketplace, stalls were closing. A final cart with onion skins, and manure made its rounds, destined for the fields. The scent was oddly sweet, turning the air swampy but fertile. The cart's driver, Nolan, hummed as he worked. His family saved manure from privies and barns alike what others despised. He sold as gold fertilizer. On certain nights, buyers would come quietly, lanterns in hand, greeting him only in whispers. Nolan counted coins while thinking of his wife, who had died in childbirth. She had used a chamber pot during her recovery. Nolan remembered how she joked that she'd never live to flush a toilet. He smiled sadly now as he closed the wooden lid. Frost covered the rooftops again. In the small clay pot markets, merchants traded both empty pitchers and those brimming with white chalk used to cover smell. Wicker baskets contained cloth rags, sometimes dipped in vinegar, bound tightly as homemade stink killers. A clever street artisan offered portable curtains, fabric screens with ropes to attach around chamber pots. They sold for a penny apiece, and mothers attached them to their children's pots first, then to their own. It was spiteful too. Say this was progressed, but it was. Wolves howled at the town's outskirts. The night dragged on. Only the moon watched as bodies relieved themselves behind trees or into pots. But not all souls were forgotten. One of the manor's pages, Samuel, lingered by the hidden latrine behind Anselm's apothecary. He lit a candle and wrote a poem into the stone bench. Beneath my feet the ghosts of legions sleep. While blossoms swirl above in careless bloom, I too must sit with nature's bitter reek, and pray each seat may keep its small perfume. He engraved a sprig of rosemary beside the words, hoping no janitor would scrub it away. This was his act of rebellion, an acknowledgement of humanity's constant negotiation with dignity. In the northern quarters, the bathhouse nearing completion, promised hot springs drawn into tiled rooms. Labourers carried clay and hall water in buckets' legs, throbbing, backs aching under both stones and shame. Townsfolk smelled sewage from yesterday's feasting, and still they came for the promise of soft steam enveloping them in harmless comfort. When it opened, even the poorest could pay a penny for a washcloth, water, dividing screen included. They bathed fully clothed at first, in modesty. Later, they soon arrived naked and dripping, marvelling as the plastered walls drank in the heat rather than their shame. Sickness loomed dysentery again, but people now approached it differently. Midwives and barbers taught to launder beyond. Linens, limbs, mouths, wounds. Chamber pots were washed in vinegar, rags boiled. Water was precious and often stolen, but care now had dignity. Back at the manor, a sudden leak sent foul water spilling down. The stairwell calculations had failed. Soil lines cracked, waste built up. The servants scuttled, cleaning cloths. In hand, Sir Holcomb himself came down, eyes furious. "I won't restart without a better plan," he declared. That night, he drew diagrams by candlelight showing improved angles and twin pipes. His manor's stewardship became legend and burden. In the village church, Father Aldwyn conducted baptisms by the font. Mothers carried their newborns, and after dunking, he pronounced clean of sin, a spiritual cleansing mirrored in the act of washing. Some villagers whispered it was hypocrisy, holy baptism for spirit, stench for earth, but others felt it as a promise. God may forgive, but we must strive for earthly clean too. As dawn broke again, the routine restarted. The castle caretaker carried pots from the solar, clinking softly. Nolan rolled out his manure cart. Isabel and Marigold emptied theirs. Samuel swept stone. The bathhouse simmered steam. Margaret polished equipment. Aldwyn blessed water. Old Winner collected it all. In the small tragedies of spillage, smell, leak, pride, and laughter, this was medieval life's messy beauty, not just survival, but a stubborn human determination to carve dignity from filth. And centuries later, we still flush, scrub, cover, and, perhaps, owe them a whisper of thanks for showing us how to begin in the heart of Wickenford's crumbling stone quarter, just beneath the moss-covered tower that leaned slightly eastward like a drunken sentry. Young Elric stirred from a restless sleep. The chill that had crept in during the late hours of the night still clung to the walls like a second skin, and his wool blanket coarse and threadbare offered little relief. He had dreamt again of the bathhouse, not the steaming new one in the northern quarter, but the old wooden one long demolished, where his mother once worked, scrubbing backs and whispering prayers into the steam for coin. She had been gone 3 winters now, and the memory of her humming as she rinsed linen in grey soapy water returned like smoke to his mind. Elric sat up, pulling on his rough-spun tunic, and crossed to the corner where the family shared. Chamber pot sat under a slanted shelf. It had been his job to empty it this week. His father said it built character, though it mostly built calluses on the soles of his feet from cold walks across stone at dawn. With practiced hands, Elric lifted the ceramic pot, careful not to spill its contents. The bottom was crusted from use, despite frequent rinsing, and it gave off a sour odor that twisted in the morning air. He took the back stair, avoiding the creaking steps, and made his way to the disposal ditch at the edge of the property where refuse flowed slowly into the communal channel that eventually fed into the lower stream. Rats skittered away as he approached. Elric tipped the pot, heard the splash, and leaned on the wall with a sigh. He sometimes imagined that someone, centuries from now, would look back at this place and marvel that people once lived this way, not with disdain, but with curiosity. He'd heard the priests speak of ancient Romans and their marble latrines, as if they'd had dignity built into their toilets. Here, in the filth of Wickenford, dignity had to be invented from scratch each morning. At the same hour, across the courtyard, in a slightly better-off home, Mistress Thelma was scolding her son Tobias. He had neglected to clean the family's nightpot the evening before, and the stench had woken his younger sister in tears. Tobias, red-faced and silent, accepted the tongue-lashing while rubbing sleep from his eyes. Thelma muttered that she missed her old maid, Cerise, who had once handled such matters with military precision until she'd run off with a travelling tanner last autumn. Tobias swore under his breath and grabbed the sloshing pot with both hands, trying not to let it slop on his boots. He was 16, lanky, and full of dreams about ships and anything to get away from the stink of earthbound life. As he poured the contents into the back alley trench and rinsed it with river water from a leather flask, he wondered how nobles avoided such disgrace. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just had someone else do the disgraceful things for them, indeed. In the manor house, Lady Isadora sat perched like a porcelain doll upon a cushioned wooden seat inside the royal garderobe narrow stone recess, built into the castle's western wall. Below her, waste disappeared into the abyss, a vertical shaft that led to the moat. She hated it. Despite the tapestries hung to mask the cold, the place always smelled of mildew and something worse something, sweet and sickly. She longed for the perfume of spring gardens, not this stale breath of stone. She wrinkled her nose and reached for the sprig of lavender her lady-in-waiting had placed nearby. Beside her, a bronze basin held a folded cloth and a small clay jar of rosewater. She dabbed her fingers and then leaned back against the cushioned stone, trying not to think about what lay below. She had once written to her cousin in Paris about their plumbing, only to receive a smug reply detailing the latest privy innovations in the French court, including porcelain bowls and flowing water from rooftop cisterns. Isadora hadn't written back. Meanwhile, down in the servants' hall, young Maud was scrubbing out the chamber pots lined against the wall like grim sentries. Her hands were cracked, her fingers raw from hours of contact with lye soap and ice-cold water. There were 7 pots today, each labelled with a chalk mark to denote its owner. The Lord's was always the worst. Maud suspected he often missed on purpose. The chamber was poorly lit, and no one dared suggest improvements, lest it offend the nobility's delicate sensibilities. So she worked in silence, humming to herself an old lullaby her grandmother once sang, where roses wilt and violets fade. The soul is cleaned by what hands have made. She doubted her soul was getting cleaner, but the pots certainly were. At the village bathhouse, steam rose thick and slow into the rafters as a dozen men gathered on the stone benches, buckets at their feet. Water heated in massive iron kettles, was poured sparingly over cloths and skin. They washed as best they could, modestly, sometimes grimly, their eyes avoiding each other. For many, this was the only chance they had to rid themselves of the week's grime and stink. The attendant Barlow stoked the fires below the water room and whistled tunelessly. He'd heard every sort of confession pass through these walls, not the sins of the soul, but the confessions of the body. Boils, rot, lice, discomforts whispered to him in exchange for healing salves or vinegar cloths. He never judged. He simply handed over the remedies and nodded solemnly. Back at the monastery, Brother Gerwin penned a treatise on cleanliness and spiritual grace. He believed deeply in the sanctity of washing, not just for the body, but for the soul. If the Lord saw fit to make rivers, he wrote, then surely he intended for us to use them. He had even constructed a rudimentary flushing system using carved stone channels and gravity-fed sluices. His fellow monks thought him eccentric, but none could argue with the results. Their latrines no longer stank, and illness had reduced significantly. Still, the abbot warned against vanity. Clean arse, proud heart, he'd muttered during morning prayers, but Brother Gerwin only smiled. He would convert them one pot at a time, outside the convent walls. A group of village children played in the reeds near the communal ditch, tossing pebbles and laughing. The water was brown and sluggish, a ribbon of filth that separated the village from the forest, but they were children and knew no better. One of them, a girl named Esme, held her nose and dared the others to touch the water. They shrieked and scattered, their laughter echoing like birdsong. Esme's mother, a washerwoman, stood nearby beating sheets against a flat rock, her hands swollen from soap and cold. She had no time to worry about the purity of the stream, only that it flowed, and that it would rinse out the sins of another day. Night fell again, and with it the quiet rituals resumed. Pots were emptied, floors swept, cloths soaked. In one house, a husband and wife argued over whose turn it was to carry out the waste. In another, an old man slipped on his way to the latrine and died before morning. In yet another, a young woman took her newborn to the privy for the first time, weeping softly at the crude indignity of it all. This was life, raw and unsanitized, unfolding one moment at a time across chamber pots, cold stone, and the hope of warmth. The town bells chimed midnight, and Elric lay in bed again, the pot clean beside him. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant howl of wolves and the nearer rustle of rats in the walls. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. But maybe, just maybe, he would visit the bathhouse and ask for work. He could carry buckets, or sweep coals, anything to trade the stench of waste for the scent of steam. And so Wickenford carried on, chamber by chamber, pot by pot, burdened and blessed by the most human of needs. The history of its bathrooms, private, shared, sacred, and profane, was not one of luxury or elegance, but of perseverance. It was a reminder, written in stone and filth, that even in the darkest of ages, people still tried to be clean. There was a particular chill in the air that late October morning. The fog lay heavy across the village of Dunworth, curling over thatched roofs and creeping between stone walls like something alive. Marjorie shivered as she stepped out into the alley behind the bakery, clutching a worn wooden bucket, its sloshing contents only slightly less foul than the stench of the street itself. Her shift was damp at the hem, and the soles of her boots were slick with a morning's worth of mud and human waste. The alley had become the unofficial latrine for the back row of cottages, a makeshift arrangement built more from desperation than design. There were no proper facilities in Dunworth Knout, unless you counted the Abbey's stone garderobes, perched proudly above their private stream like the bow of a ship. Those were reserved for the monks, of course, and visitors of noble blood. The rest, like Marjorie, did their business in chamber pots, buckets, or on particularly desperate nights directly into the street, hoping the next rain would carry it away. That spring, the transformation spread. The manor added a small garderobe covered in thatch. The alehouse built a squat pit out back behind the stable. The tanner upgraded his buckets, lined them with lime, and traded better hides. Marjorie became the de facto cleaner invited into richer homes, paid in coin rather than charity. She'd never imagine all that from a half-cracked clay bucket and a monk's stubborn heart. Yet it was not perfect. The river still carried runoff from the village. Rats still converged on orchards at night. Flies still found entry near open kitchens. But for every time disease hit, 2 villages now survived. And for every old sickness, they whispered, another. Life was saved. In June, the Abbey held a festival to bless the fields. As music drifted across the river, Elric, Brother Gerwin, and Marjorie stood by the sanctuary. Stone was set at the pit's edge, inscribed with a simple cross and the words, "Here begins water, ash, and mercy," in the years that followed. Weakenford led the region in clean living. Other villages sent visitors to learn a primitive sanitation fare. Lord Tomlin built a bathhouse, though private. Thomas expanded the bakery, adding more ovens near a clean water source. Even Father Anselm installed a cistern in the churchyard. For Marjorie, it was a life changed. No longer did she kneel in freezing mud at dawn. She still carried buckets, but with respect, not shame. When someone asked how she'd come to know soap and ash, she looked at Elric, the monk who taught her to wash hands, not hide hands. She smiled quietly. That winter, when frost bit cold and long, the village shut every door and window, but inside homes, the air was warmer steam rising from pots, meat cooking on hearths, water poured into basins. Disease ebbed, muscles ached less, mortality dropped. The villagers' children cleaned handed, Brighted played freely in the fields, and the world began to brighten by the time the 13th century turned its weary face toward the uncertainties of the 14th medieval society had already grown tangled in a web of contradictions. On one hand, kings, nobles, and bishops poured funds into cathedrals and castles with soaring towers and stone vaults. On the other hand, the peasants still squatted over wooden planks above foul-smelling ditches, and even royal latrines were little more than gravity-fed holes built into thick walls. It was a time where ceremony and filth often existed side by side, and nowhere was this contrast more visible or more pungent than in the medieval bathroom, in the Benedictine monastery of St. Alcuin's, tucked between the rolling moors and wild rivers of northern England. A young novice named Aldwin carried the task no one else wanted. Every week he was charged with maintaining the Reri Daughter, the communal latrine used by the monks, a 2-story stone outbuilding with a long trench below, through which water from a diverted stream sluggishly trickled. The monks prided themselves on cleanliness, as far as medieval standards allowed, but even their efforts couldn't mask the odor of human waste soaking the air like wet wool. Aldwin moved carefully through the stone corridors before sunrise, his sandals echoing softly in the chill. He carried a bucket of lime and a ragged cloth, his hands raw from the caustic powder. The monastic rules insisted on humility and cleanliness, bodily and spiritual, but nothing about the Reri daughter ever felt spiritual. Still, Baldwin found a strange kind of reflection in the quiet mornings among the echoes of dripping water and the faint chants from the chapel beyond the walls. Elsewhere in the countryside, villagers faced different latrine realities. In hamlets, like Wormstead or Hollowmarsh, homes were clustered tightly together, thatched roofs shedding flecks of straw into the muddy streets below. Behind most homes, small wooden structures known as privy houses leaned at crooked angles, often shared between several families. These outhouses were little more than wooden seats above shallow pits, and they reeked terribly during summer months. But for villagers like Marjorie, a widowed herbwoman who sold bunches of dried sage and feverfew at the market, the privy was more than just necessary, it was dangerous. Thieves often hid near communal toilets, particularly at night. Some believed demons or spirits haunted the latrines, whispering in the wind and pinching your skin when you squatted in the dark. Marjorie herself had heard the tale of Ildwin the baker, who'd fallen into the pit behind his house one stormy night and wasn't found until the following morning, drowned in his own filth. Whether the story was true didn't matter. Fear clung to the act of relieving oneself, fear of disease, spirits, or simply the shame of being seen in castles. Things were more advanced, but not necessarily better. At Fenmark Castle, Sir Geoffrey of Bridlingham paced his chamber nervously, awaiting a visit from the Bishop of Cairn. The bishop's visits were always unpleasant, self-important, nosy, always commenting on Geoffrey's lack of proper divine cleanliness. In preparation, servants had scrubbed the garderobes, the castle's version of toilets, though they could never quite remove the sour stench that lingered in the air like mold on cheese. Castle garderobes were often built into the exterior walls, with narrow chutes extending downward so waste could fall directly into the moat or a cellar. These vertical shafts were a marvel of simplicity, yet they were notorious for backdrafts, flies, and worse, freezing in winter and boiling in summer. Some garderobes included wooden seats and even fabrics to cover the opening, but most offered little more than a hole and a prayer. Despite these limitations, some nobles attempted comfort. Geoffrey's wife, Lady Eleanor, imported rosewater and pressed lavender into sachets to hang near her private latrine. She even insisted on linen cloths for wiping, though these had to be washed and boiled by the castle's laundresses, a task they dreaded more than cleaning chamber pots. Eleanor claimed she could not abide the smell of the common rushes that lined public toilets or chamber pots, replaced weekly and sometimes sprinkled with herbs like mint or thyme. And there were, of course, chamber pots ubiquitous across medieval life. Rich or poor, everyone had them. Shaped from clay, bronze, or wood, they rested under beds, beside chairs, and under benches. In cities like London or Paris, entire households emptied their pots into the streets below with little warning, shouting "Gardi" before unleashing the deluge. It was said that an inattentive pedestrian could be baptized in urine by mid-morning. Children often found it amusing, while travelers found it revolting, clothed. A merchant's daughter in Rouen despised the daily task of carrying the night soil to the alley behind her father's wine shop, but it fell to her after her mother's passing, and she completed it with a cloth tied around her mouth and sleeves pulled over her hands. More than once she dropped the pot or tripped on the uneven cobblestones, weeping as the contents spilled across her boots. In universities like those in Bologna or Oxford, students faced latrine challenges of their own. Shared dormitories meant shared privies, often located at the edge of the college. The waste was sometimes carted away by nightmen who were paid handsomely but reviled socially. Rumors persisted of students hazing each other by tipping chamber pots onto beds or down staircases. In one recorded incident, a dispute between students from different towns resulted in someone blocking a latrine shaft with books and animal bones, causing a week-long overflow that forced the entire dormitory to relocate. Even the church, for all its splendor and sanctity, could not avoid the earthly problem of waste. Cathedral builders in cities like Cologne and Canterbury engineered impressive latrine systems for clergy. Cloisters were designed with water channels flowing beneath them, and monks were sometimes required to bathe before services. But these systems often broke down. Drainage ditches clogged with leaves and waste, and without regular maintenance, the sacred spaces became breeding grounds for illness. During one summer, a canon at York Minster named Father Thomas contracted dysentery that spread rapidly among the clergy. It was traced back to a blocked drain beneath the cloister latrines, where stagnant water had festered for weeks. The scandal forced the archbishop to issue a decree requiring monthly inspections of all monastic waste, systems of policy that would later spread to other dioceses. All the while, herbalists and apothecaries offered remedies for the consequences of poor hygiene. Constipation, diarrhea, and intestinal worms were rampant. Wormwood, mint, and tansy were common prescriptions. Some people inserted leeks or garlic into their rectums to purge bad humors. In wealthier homes, enemas were administered by trained servants using devices made of pig bladder and horn. These clysters were unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, but often considered necessary. By the late 14th century, with the Black Death having scarred the memory of the continent, attention to sanitation began to rise, though slowly. People began to connect waste with sickness, though the theory of miasmabad air still reigned. Cities passed laws requiring latrines to be built away from wells. Nightmen were given official licenses. Some towns, like York, even taxed residents for the removal of waste, with strict rules about disposal. But for all these changes, daily bathroom practices remained largely unchanged for the peasantry. Most people relieved themselves in the woods, behind barns, or into pits dug hastily and covered with leaves. Children were taught early to squat and wipe with moss, old cloth, or nothing at all. There was little shame, only necessity. Privacy was rare, dignity rarer still. And yet, in this world of filth and survival, humor endured. Songs were sung about accidents in privies. Jokes were made at the expense of noblemen who slipped into moats. Ballads told of knights who farted during courtship, or monks who snored on the privy and fell in. It was a filthy world, yes, but one in which people still laughed, still coped, still carried on. A travelling minstrel named Bertwald once performed at a village fair, singing a now-forgotten tune called The Pox in the Pot, mocking a lord who caught a rash from sitting on a cold stone latrine. The crowd roared with laughter, peasants and nobles alike, all united in the one experience none could escape. The necessity and indignity of the medieval bathroom, even today, when historians peer back into this world through fragile manuscripts and excavated cesspits, they find traces of a life that was raw, earthy, and unfiltered. Seeds of berries, fragments of fabric, bones, and Lysol speak of the day-to-day struggle to maintain something like decency in a world where waste was never far from sight, and somewhere in the dust of old castles, beneath the mossy stones of ruined monasteries, and buried in the soil of forgotten villages. The ghosts of 1,000 relieved souls still whisper their stories, not with grandeur, but with grimy, unforgettable honesty by the final stretch of winter. The stones of Eldergate Abbey had absorbed not just centuries of prayers and sermons, but also the whispers of its privy wall stories of monks, pilgrims, servants, and even visiting nobles, each contributing, quite literally, to the ecosystem beneath their feet. Isabel, now 2 months into her service at the Abbey as assistant to Brother Aldrich, had grown disturbingly accustomed to the rhythms of medieval sanitation. She could now diagnose illnesses by the smell of chamber pot contents and identify who had used the garderobe most recently just by listening to the footsteps overhead. She had even mastered the fine art of boiling linen strips in ash lye without gagging. Frost had set in so firmly that the communal latrines near the South Gatehouse had frozen into dangerous columns. The night before, a young novice named Emmerich had nearly broken his ankle slipping on the icy rim of the bench. Brother Aldrich, ever watchful and curious about human suffering as both a scholar and a man of the cloth, noted the incident in his leather-bound ledger. "The cold has turned human waste into sculpture," he muttered to Isabel, who replied dryly, "Perhaps it's time we admit this abbey is more cesspit than sanctuary." But that wasn't entirely fair. Despite the horrid smells and constant threat of disease, the abbey had become a beacon of relative progress. Thanks to Aldrich's persistence, a crude pulley system had been installed to hoist waste buckets down the southern cliffside, where they could be dumped away from the wells. Isabel herself had designed a funnel from sheep bladders to redirect urine away from the walkways. It didn't solve the problem, but it helped. The monks now joked that she had a divine mind for filth. Stories from the village kept trickling in grim, raw tales of families losing half their children to dysentery, of landowners who still made their servants carry chamber pots across open fields rather than allow them to build a new latrine. A farmer named Aidan came knocking one dusk with a burlap sack of barley and an offer. If Aldrich and Isabel could help him purify his family's well, he'd allow them to study the ancient Roman clay piping system buried beneath his land. It was a rare opportunity. Many still scoffed at Roman ideas, dismissing aqueducts and sewers as pagan leftovers. But Aldrich had long believed the past held lessons worth reviving, so they went. In the stillness of dawn, the cart trundled down the frost-lined road toward Aidan's farm, wheels creaking, the sack of barley bouncing beside Isabel's foot. She thought about how different her life had become since arriving at the Abbey. Once she had dreamt of being a weaver, or perhaps even a midwife, but now her days were spent sketching crude maps of waste flow and debating whether soap root or crushed lavender better masked the stench of rot. Yet in the quiet moments, when the sun touched the frost and the world looked silver instead of grey, she felt something strange dash pride at Aidan's farm. The excavation revealed remnants of a narrow channel lined with red clay bricks, the edges worn but intact. It stretched from beneath the farmhouse to what had once been a communal latrine, long filled in by mud and weeds. Aldrich crouched beside it with a reverence usually reserved for relics. They understood the movement of water, he said, and, unlike us, they feared stagnation. Isabel helped clear the passage with a flat-bladed spade, careful not to shatter the bricks. The smell was mercifully faint, just earth and time. When they finally breached the wall of mud at the far end, a gust of air whooshed through the channel, and Aldrich stood. "It still breathes," he said, awestruck. "This is what we lost." By the time they returned to the Abbey, Brother Thomas had fallen ill with a strange fever. Isabel watched Aldrich inspect the man's bedding and hands. "Boils," he said, grimly. "Not plague, but infection likely from the latrine bench. Again." They burned Thomas's cot and covered the walls in vinegar-soaked cloth. Isabel prepared a brew of elderflower, garlic, and dried sage, half medicine, half superstition, but the fever did not break. And still, despite the loss and the rot, the abbey moved forward. The monks began washing their hands more often. They sprinkled crushed rosemary in their privies. When Aldrich suggested building a second garderobe, this one with angled chutes leading to separate cesspools, the abbot finally gave his blessing. A year passed. The abbey's chronicles now included diagrams of waste systems, herbs that curbed odor, and records of diseases tracked through privy inspection. Aldrich wrote letters to other monasteries, urging them to rethink their approach to sanitation. Some responded with scorn. "Waste is not fit for theological debate," one scoffed. But others, especially those near rivers where disease spread, fast began asking for advice. Isabel grew older, and her hands roughened with work. She no longer flinched when hauling brine buckets or emptying linen bins soaked in vinegar. Instead, she found joy in efficiency, joy in knowing that fewer children died that winter than the one before. The local midwife even asked her advice, once whispering about a rash that wouldn't go away. Isabel offered nettle wash and strict cleanliness. The rash faded. For a moment, she felt like a healer. At Harvest Festival that year, Aldrich gave a small sermon on humility, not just of spirit, but of body. "The body is sacred," he said, "and to tend it, even in its most vile necessities, is not shameful but godly." The older monks fidgeted in their robes, but the younger ones nodded. The villagers listened, though many still used bushes and ditches and rarely washed their hands. Still, the seed was planted. In their final project together, Isabel and Aldrich began crafting a manual, De Puritate Corporis. On the cleanliness of the body, it documented everything they had learned, how wind direction affected odor, which woods absorbed less urine, how waste runoff could poison barley fields, and how communal baths might, if cleaned daily, prevent the spread of skin disease. It was part science, part theology, and wholly radical, when Aldrich died to winters. Later, Isabel took his place, not as a monk, of course, but as the abbey's steward of cleanliness, a title no one had used before. Children now learned to wash with ash soap. Rainwater was stored in clay cisterns. The abbey's walls still smelled of vinegar and thyme. But disease visited less often. She would grow old there, overseeing the toilets, the buckets, and the blessedly dry walkways. Some mocked her title, but most thanked her quietly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with an extra fish from the river. When she finally passed, the abbey carved her likeness into the wall beside the garderobe, head bowed, holding a sprig of rosemary. Not a saint, but perhaps something stranger and more enduring. The woman who made even excrement sacred. So, if you ever visit the ruins of an old monastery and feel the sudden urge to turn away at the smell, remember someone, long ago, made sure it didn't smell even worse. Someone like Isabel. Someone who chose to find grace, not in grandeur, but in the gutter. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real story was all along. If this journey through the filth and brilliance of medieval bathrooms stirred something in you, or at least made you laugh, shudder, or stay awake just a little longer, don't forget to like this video. Leave a comment with your favorite bizarre detail, and subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the forgotten corners of history. And if you're still awake, maybe it's time to rethink how we flush the past away.